First Nations and Métis, including the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations. This territory, governed by the Upper Canada Treaties, is within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement and adjacent to the Haldeman Tract. As gardeners, we gather on these treaty lands, recognizing our responsibility to honor, respect, and protect this land, plants, and animals, and we acknowledge its traditional custodians. So tonight, as mentioned, we have Darrell Bley, who is giving us the second presentation. I'm not going to say too much about him because we've already done that. He is the main person looking after everything woody at the Niagara Parks. So definitely the person to talk to about your woody issues. I have to say, yesterday I listened to Darrell's first talk and I enjoyed it as much, or probably even more, because I was sitting in the lovely, quiet, peaceful computer room, minus any Zoom issues. And it was really lovely. I really enjoyed it. So tonight he's going to be looking at the movement of woody plants from A to B, so that the distribution is going to look very different to what it was long ago. As Janet has already mentioned, please put any comments in the chat, and questions for Darrell's presentation, please put them in the Q&A. And I think that's it. So let's go to Darrell.
All right, thanks very much, Kate. And it's good to be back. And I'm going to, everybody can see that. Maybe just give me a heads up. That's good. And the voice is coming through. Everything's fine. Okay, I'm just gonna. Okay, so I can move the screen. Everything's good. So we're gonna get started. This is a topic that has always interested me. And when I kind of think about things I'd like to talk about, it's often something that I've read a lot about. And my intention is always to gather information from the left and gather information from the right, you know, from this idea, from that theory, and just kind of put it all together. And so I kind of do that in my mind when I'm reading those types of things. And that's kind of what I hope I'm going to unfold tonight. And, you know, I'm not leaning in kind of any one direction. It's just really reading, you know, listening to a lot of webinars from different scientific experts and people in that field, and kind of moving forth from there. So what I really want to talk about is species distribution. And what we need to realize, and kind of what I'm going to end with, is that it does have an ebb and a flow, and that plants really constantly need to move in order to survive as things change, whether that's climate, whether that's habitat, maybe it's habitat loss, you know, those types of things, not to put a negative spin on it, but there's many reasons why we have an ebb and flow of plants. And as they move, that's key. So they've been doing that for a long time. And so this image of ginkgo is important because ginkgo's been with us a very long time. And if we kind of set that stage and think about where ginkgo is as a native plant, it's just in a very isolated pocket. And at one time, it had a really global dominance. And that's kind of what we're here to think a little bit about. Why does it not have that global dominance anymore? You know, what has changed? So like ginkgo, this is metasequoia, you know, those epics, those journeys were very big. And the story of ginkgo is almost the same as the story of metasequoia. Those are big, epic journeys. And this is a more local journey. This is a journey here in North America. And when you look at cacti, cacti are really found, 99% of cacti are North America. And they're not in other parts of the world. They're just really North American. Succulents are different. Succulents have a global territory. Cacti, just really North America. And that's kind of interesting. So why is that? I haven't explored that. I haven't really thought about that. I haven't really read too much about it, but maybe that's going to be the next topic, but that's kind of interesting. I find that interesting. So some things are very specific in how they move, you know, and other plants, very rapid movement, very, not random necessarily, but, you know, they cover vast distances. Well, other things are a little bit more slow, steady, and contrived. So we got Cercidophyllum, we got Zelkova. So they're a little bit more refined in their movement and in their distribution. We're going to go backwards in time. We're going to think about what has happened from an ecological time scale. And our monkey puzzle tree, it's been around for a long time. And it's pretty isolated into where it is in its pocket of native habitats. It's very specific. And at one time it wasn't. And this is an interesting slide. I chose a plant that was very old and a plant that's much younger. And this is wheat. And wheat hasn't been around really for that long. This is a natural, wheat is a natural hybridization between two closely related plants. And, you know, wheat was the result. And then obviously we've done lots of selections and breeding on wheat, but really just as a genus and species, it hasn't been around that long. So we had a student that did some internship at Arnold Arboretum, and there's some very smart people at Arnold Arboretum. And the students really, you know, they get to spend a lot of time with these people. And they had one of the arborists. I was just reading student diaries tonight, and certain names always come up. And these are people that the students really find inspiring and so forth. And this was one of those individuals. And we've had lots of students come back and that same name keeps creeping up. But the young lady who did an internship at Arnold, she came back and she said, you know, they said something really incredible, this person. They said a botanical gardens is a place where family reunions can take place. It's a place where long lost cousins, aunts, and uncles from around the world are brought together to be reunited. And they're talking about plants here. And that's kind of an interesting perspective. So we talked a little bit about, you know, certain mutualistic relationships and how important they were to the migration of species, to the movement of species. And what we want to do is we want to dig much deeper into what are the causal agents, or what is the causal situations of plant migration and plants moving. So like last time, I'm always interested in a subject because I like to do a lot of reading, and one book will lead me into another. The books that are common is this one here. This is a book that was on the last topic about mutualism. And this is, like I said, it's a heavy duty read. You know, have to really sit down and digest, but it's very well footnoted. So there's a lot of good meat and potatoes information. And that's a very interesting book. So, you know, this book here from our German friend, this really talks about continental drift, and, you know, that theory is not that old. This is a very nice book about Krakatoa, but it has a lot to do with plate tectonics and the movement of both flora and fauna from different rafted parts of the world being rafted together. And obviously along that fault line where we have this fauna and flora meeting that are quite diverse and quite different, we have eruptions in Krakatoa. It's a story about Krakatoa, but it's a story about a lot more than that. We had another book by Pillow about northern evergreens, and this is a nice book called After the Ice Ages, and it talks about plant migration and plant movement. So that's a nice little book. For those that love geology, this is a book called Canada Rocks, and it really tells the story about all the rocks in Canada and where they originated from, and those that came from another part of our world that were rafted over here and kind of left here. That's a very interesting book. Then there's some specific books here, one on Cercidophyllum and kind of its fossil evidence and so forth. That's an interesting one. And then what I really like is this book on biogeography. That's kind of where we're heading with our topic. So those are some good books to share. So today we're going to talk about biogeography. We need to kind of look at some geological timescales. Just hang in with me, because it's kind of important. We're definitely going to talk about our supercontinent and the rafting of plant material. We need to really always go back to fossil evidence, because that tells us quite a bit of where these plants were a long time ago. And throughout that, we need to talk a little bit about mechanisms for dispersal. So the idea of biogeography is just simple. It's really exactly what, like it says on the screen, it's really the patterns of distribution of plants, flora, fauna, and it's based on barriers, geographical barriers. We need lots of time, and it has to do with obviously different locations on the planet. So that's kind of an interesting read, the idea of using the word biogeography to really talk a little bit about that. It really kind of goes right back to our friend, Mr. Darwin there. And it's interesting, there's a lot of people who were kind of competing for that idea of evolution, whether it's plants, whether it's animals, and Darwin just kind of beat them to the punch. If we go back a little bit, in this book over here of Krakatoa, they definitely talk about the Watson line. And Watson did share his theory of evolution with our friend Darwin. Just didn't get the publication out fast enough. But that's an interesting, that line. It's a divisionary line where an island within a stone throw of another island, and the island is behind, let's say, we have islands to the left and islands to the right. And they've rafted together, and the species within a stone throw of each other are very different. The birds are very different. Lots of morphological features on animals are very different. The plants are very different. They just haven't mixed and mingled just yet. So, back to the idea of plants changing, animals morphing due to necessity and survival mechanisms. It kind of all relates to that. And definitely biogeography is a newer way of kind of looking at that. So what we need to do is we need to kind of look at biogeography, apply it to plants, and we need to look for a pattern. These images that you see, there's a book that, it's a kind of heavy duty taxonomic book. It's by an author by the name of Kruseman with a K, K-R-U-S-S, like Kruseman. And it's really a heavy duty taxonomic book, but they do a kind of a good job at the beginning, looking at the main distribution of woody plants globally. Not all species, but quite a few. So this is where these come from. What I need you to do is I need you to kind of think a little bit about what is the pattern. So I'm just going to go through that for a second. I'm going to see if you can kind of pick out that pattern. There's Acer. Carpinus. What's a similarity as far as distribution? I'm giving you, one of the answers. Both of these, I'm going to go back, are found in the northern hemisphere, not in the southern hemisphere, the northern hemisphere. So Acer, Carpinus, different families. There's a legume, Cercis. It's found in the northern hemisphere, but there's another pattern that's very evident. There's a rhythm there, and the rhythm's from left to right or right to left, whichever way you want to look at it. Going backwards, Carpinus, Acer. The rhythm is North America, Europe, and Asia. So three very distinct distribution patterns in the northern hemisphere on three continental areas. So think about, the land that separates these and the oceans that separate, the rest. It's pretty vast territories. Gleditsia, it's the same thing. Northern distribution, but three very strong geographical locations that are mimicking the other 4 or 5 examples. So we need to think about why. What is pattern 1, and why do we have pattern 1? Because it's the same pattern. Whether it's Carpinus, Cercis, Acer, and Gladitia. So what we need to do is think a little bit about why that is, why that's happened, and what's the causal reason for that. So I'm just going to look at some theories. So what we need to do first is we need to look at broad brushstrokes, and then we'll kind of refine those brushstrokes as we get going. But to set the stage, we're going to look at three things: allopatric speciation, our little buddy Carl Wegner, continental drift theory, and we have to get to some geological timescales because that's important. So there are 5 of them I need to go through when we get to number 3, and then we'll get past those and we'll go from there. So allopatric speciation is kind of like based on Darwin's theory with the finches and the different beaks, or the Watson line, back in Indonesia. What we have is we have potentially an original population of something, and we have a lot of time. And this individual species is rocking and rolling, and it's up against, for its survival, it's up against different barriers. It needs to continue to survive. It needs to continue to adapt. But somewhere along the way, geographically, we split. Over a long time, geographically, one species is split apart through whatever mechanism, a geographic barrier. Continental drift is a geographic barrier. Now we have this individual on 2 sides of an equation. It's not cross-pollinating like this. It really now is needing to survive on this side on its own, using its own mechanisms. And this idea over here, this species on this part of the world, needs to rock and roll and make opportunities to perpetuate itself. So what we end up doing really is we have reproduction in an isolated position. And over a long time, we have 2 species that aren't able to then cross-pollinate anymore. A species is a species because it doesn't cross-pollinate with another species in that genus. Some hybridization does occur, but species within a genus, they are defined as a species because they're not pollinating anymore, cross-pollination. So that's that allopatric speciation. And a good example would be our Liriodendron. I can't read down here. I think I have the species name wrong. Liriodendron tulipifera is our northern counterpart. And Liriodendron, it should be chinensis. I might have orientalis. I can't read that part of the screen. So I think I have it wrong in there, but it is Liriodendron chinensis. I kind of, I noticed that and forgot to change it. That's kind of what that is. So these aren't cross-pollinated. They look very similar. But, in theory, the theory is they started out as one Liriodendron. It used to exist in Europe. That doesn't exist anymore. But we have an Asian counterpart and a North American counterpart. So that's kind of, we're going to bring that term up every once in a while. I've got some dates here attached to our friend Alfred Wegner. Alfred Wegner is a young man, was studying to be an astronomist. And he kind of veered. And it's a good thing he did veer. And he started really looking at fossil evidence and started to realize that there's a lot of similarities to certain fossils in South America as compared to Africa. Certain species would have been through fossil records identified in Africa, and also maybe then India and Australia. So how did that happen? So he postulated the idea of continental drift in 1912. He really was, his colleagues who went under professional review and preview didn't agree. He passed away in 1931, and continental drift wasn't accepted until 1965. That's not that long ago, if you think about it. That's 60 years ago, less than 60 years ago. So continental drift that we seem to be pretty comfortable with today was really only accepted by the professionals and scientists in 1965 at a conference. They finally accepted that theory. So that's pretty incredible. So we understand that there's convection. We understand that the continents have been moving, and there's lots of evidence of a lot of supercontinents that broke apart, reconfigured and broke apart, and so forth. So that continental drift theory, we're comfortable with that. And so Alfred Wegener was really kind of looking at fossil remains that were very identical. And you can kind of see that they're crossing the boundaries of these main continental plates. And really, we're looking here in the southern entity. So from a Pangea point of view, when it separated, that southern entity was Gondwana. And this is really that group of rafts, if you will. And that's kind of what he was studying, and that kind of made him postulate that idea. So I'm going to look at some geological timelines, which there are hundreds of them. We're going to focus on these ones up here. What I need you to kind of focus on, and these will come up as we go through them. I'm going to go through them somewhat quickly, but we're at about 250 million years ago, and we're coming up to about 3 million years ago over in here. So let's kind of get to task and get through that. What you need to realize, and what I've realized, is that there's a lot of different names. So if we talk about eons, there definitely is names here that are eon focused. There are also eras with different names, and then also periods. And actually there's another column in here which isn't included in this chart. So it really depends on, if we're talking about a certain period, we use these names. If we're talking about an era, we're using these names. I'm going to talk about these periods in here using these particular names over here. So I just, out of another chart, I just did some cutting and pasting, and I'm really at the Triassic period. And that's the time scale of about 250 million to 200 million years ago. And what was happening then? Pangea existed. At the back end of that, it started to break apart at the seams. And I just put some red lines in there. And that's kind of are the major seams that it broke apart on. You can kind of see definitely North America. You can see South America, Africa. It's kind of handy to see it just with our configuration of countries today, China, Asia, etc. We can see down here, Antarctica and Australia. But those are the major rifts, if you will. And then there's another, the Rift Valley in Africa is right in here. That was another rift that started to break apart. So at that time, things existed. All right. So we're going to switch over to this same map without the countries, but the same lines and the same ideas. Okay, so we're going to switch to this image as compared to the previous image with all the countries listed. What existed during that time? Obviously, we had a more warmer climate, and our carbon levels were really high, like astronomically high at that time. So coal-based flora was being replaced with primitive conifers. At that time, cycads and ginkgo existed. Obviously, we had lots of different animals out there. The Appalachian Mountains existed because we had that land crashing, creating that. They were high mountains, really. They were like plus 20,000 feet, and we had high CO2 levels. So we're starting to get some plants that would then have some fossil evidence being able to be attached to them, and we go from there. We're now moving. We're moving into the Jurassic period. We're moving forward about 50 million years. And so we have, obviously, in these periods, we have an early, middle, and a late. So that's kind of the time frame for that. What was happening is Pangea definitely was starting to split apart. You can see Gondwana separating, but still quite firmly attached in that Africa, South America idea. You can definitely see the northern part of Pangea rafting, but there's still a good connection between North America, Europe, and Asia. We are starting to raft southwards. We are starting to raft northwards. What is happening as well? Well, we know ginkgos and cycads are still there, but conifers are showing up. Certain bird species are existing. Lizard species are increasing. Oops. And we have some small mammals existing. So things have moved forward. most importantly, can I kind of focus on, we know birds move things around, and we see conifers coming in right now. So that's kind of 50 million years. Conifers are now on the toehold. We move forward. Again, we're moving forward into this time frame here. So as we move forward, you can definitely see things are rafting further apart. So eucalyptus is only found on Australia. So why is it there? I don't know. I'm not answering that question just yet. We still see a connection between Eurasia, and we see it shifting to a temperate climate zone. So North America and Eurasia are still connected. So angiosperms starting to dominate the planet, things with fruit, things with flower. Insects are starting to increase, from the beetles to more complex insects. Dinosaurs still kicking around, but things are going to get messy. And we see the Rocky Mountains starting to form, another barrier, if you will, a physical barrier in this case. So this is an important time frame here, 70 to 50 million years ago, because things are going to happen. And we're starting to see our continents starting to move into position. We have still some connectivity between Australia and Antarctica, still connectivity between these two big entities. We see a southward drifting and a northward drifting. But things are going to change. So angiosperms are really diversifying. They're starting to take over. North America, Northern Europe, and Northern Asia are not going to fare very well. And we're going to have a massive extinction period, actually. Dinosaurs are not in good shape, and many plants in that northern part of our world not in good shape, and the Rocky Mountains are still forming. So now we're getting pretty young over here, and we're moving 50 million years. Those continents definitely are positioned kind of very close to where they are. They move about an inch a year, and we definitely see things looking a little bit more to what we're used to. So lots of flowers exist. We see that North America and Northern Europe are recovering from mass extinction. We see the Himalayan mountains forming. In the early part of that, we see everything moved into position. Indonesia has moved into position, and there's lots of glaciation happening during that period, and that's important. So this drifting idea could account for pattern one, but it's usually more complicated than just one thing. Let's look at Metasequoia. Metasequoia is monotypic, so we can use that word kind of at two levels, at the family level or at the genus level. And Metasequoia is in the Cupressaceae family, and there's lots of members in the Cupressaceae family. It's been moved into the Cupressaceae family from the Taxodiaceae family. So it's in there with a lot of partners. So it cannot be monotypic at the family level. It has to be just monotypic at the genus, one species, and away we go. So it's a monotypic plant. Lots of fossil evidence that it exists here in North America. It exists in Europe, and it definitely existed in Northern Asia. It was a circumpolar plant, wide distribution, very, very successful. Pattern one could account for this northern drift because it was there when Pangea was drifting. Those upper parts were drifting northwards, and it's separated, into the way we see it today. So pattern one could account for that big drifting, where we did have a population in North America, Europe, and Asia at one time. But why is it now just growing in China? So pattern one may be part of it, but pattern two, pattern two is when we just find something in Asia. So at one time it was all over both of these. Now it's just here. So pattern two are plants that are not found in Asia, but we have, starting in pattern two is plants that perhaps were in pattern one, where initially they were in Europe, Asia, and North America. But something has happened. So pattern two is right now just plants that we find in Asia. So something big must have happened. Something must have wiped out those populations in North America and Europe. So when we look at this impact event, and we find lots of evidence globally, but specifically in the Northern Hemisphere, that Internal Frontier book does a very good job explaining this. So we have a nice thin layer of recognizable minerals that are kind of at the very same position. So we can carbon date that mineral. And we know that it's about 66 million years old. And it's a very thin layer. We can find it all across Europe, all Asia, and heavily in North America. So we know that this meteor impact had a big impact. North America especially was obliterated. So many, many species wiped out. Flora, fauna, lots of very, very dark time as far as the dust in the sky, no, very minimal sunlight. And it wasn't just for like 2 months, it was for several years. So we had a massive extinction in North America, Europe, less so, but still pretty devastating, and Northern Asia, but not in Southern Asia, close to the equator. And the southern part of our hemisphere, just because of wind and currents and so forth, wind patterns, less impact down there. So it was brutal. So maybe pattern 2 started out as a pattern 1, and things got wiped out 60 million years ago. And that's kind of interesting. We can find the same story with ginkgo. We can find the same story with metasequoia. And we can find the same story with our friend Cercidophyllum japonicum. Those are all quite old geological from a timescale point of view. They've been on the planet for a long time. And they would have been all around during that period of time that Pangea was drifting, moving northward for a good portion of it, and then not faring very well, perhaps 60 million years ago. And that's just kind of an interesting idea. So pattern 3 is a little different. Pattern 3 kind of looks a little bit like pattern 1. So I have the name wrong again. Sorry, down here, that should be chinensis, I think. Let's look at Liriodendron. We know that it existed in North America as Liriodendron tulipifera. We know from fossil evidence that this tulipifera species, the fossil evidence is there that that was the dominant species. And we can tell from fossil evidence that even Liriodendron tulipifera was in Asia. So that was a circumpolar plant, and it's been around for a long time. So what happened to it? Why do we see that distribution only in North America and in Asia? We don't see any in Europe. Pattern 3, there was always something left in Europe. So what happened there? So pattern 3 could have started the same as pattern 1. It becomes a northern hemispherical plant, things separate. I've got that North American, Europe, and Asian distribution. So something else most likely happened. What I said in those time frames is we had a tremendous amount in the last time frame I showed you. We have lots of glacial events, many, many of them, not just one, maybe 5 to 6. Some theories are there's 8, lots of them. Big advances of ice sheets for thousands of miles. So that's kind of interesting. So what we need to do is we need to look at natural barriers, biogeography. What are these barriers that we're talking about? We're going to look at the mountain ranges at that time, because these mountain ranges were formed. That's why I was kind of mentioning different mountain ranges that were forming. The Himalayas were formed quite a long time ago when Pangea was formed. And our buddy, the Rockies, is about 60-something million years old. So these were in place. We have massive ice coming in from the north. I'll just leave it at that for now. So we have ice and it's moving, and plants have to migrate or they're going to be in trouble. And our mountain ranges in North America, they're not exactly north-south, but they're pretty close to north-south in the bigger scope of life. But there's a nice opening in the middle here. And that allowed those plants that needed to migrate, they could continue to migrate south. And so, the temperate zone might have been down here and the Arctic zone might have been down here. But the plants, the ones that could move, successfully continued to move southward. There's no natural barrier. And they had a nice place of rest and, a little bit of relaxation for a period of time. But that movement happened several times. Some species can do it better than others. So they need to get out of the way of that big sheet of ice. So if the extent of the ice sheet was roughly around here, they had an opportunity to continue to migrate as they needed to. We look at Europe. Remember, pattern 3, we're not seeing that distribution in Europe. So something important may have been happening. Look at the barriers that we have. We've got several barriers. We've got mountain ranges that are quite east-west, all the way, right here into, the Fertile Crescent over here. So not only do we have a physical mountain barrier, we've got the Mediterranean Sea, which is a water barrier. So they're backing up against these natural barriers, and plants that aren't really good at migrating back and forth several times, they're done. Plants like spruce and pine and hemlock, not hemlocks, pine and spruce, let's say, and other things, birch, they can move back and forth lots of times, very, very good. But other plants, maybe like Liriodendron, that's not a migrator in my mind. So sometimes they could go up the mountain. Maybe they weren't successful at going up the mountain out of harm's way, but some plants are good at going up the mountain range. Some are faster in their migratory patterns. So you can see during glacial extent that the boreal forests, these are the subarctic forests, were right up against the Mediterranean. And they can tell that by pollen records, mostly it's pollen records. That Pelot, Beyond the Ice Ages, she does a great job in talking about how they use pollen records in sediment and so forth to really tell what species were present, and they can carbon date the age of that layer of sediment. So that's kind of interesting. And the tundra was right up against those mountain barriers. So things like Liriodendron that are a temperate plant, where are they going to go? They're not going to go too far. And so that really potentially is kind of what happened to Liriodendron tulipifera that were growing in Europe. And that just leaves Liriodendron tulipifera in Asia to do its thing, and the ones in North America to do its thing. And that was quite a long time ago. That was still several million years ago. And those then are going to that speciation that we talked about, they're going to start to have their own kind of morphological features and eventually not be able to cross-pollinate. So potentially that's kind of what happened. That's why we bring this slide back in, that allopatric speciation and Liriodendron in Europe. It's done. It doesn't exist anymore. So that's kind of interesting. And magnolia is another example. And both of them are in the Magnoliaceae family. Just that, I don't think it's just something I just realized, but they don't exist. Magnolias as a native plant do not exist in Europe. Fossil evidence shows us they do, but not anymore. So potentially another example of a pattern 3, Catalpa, same thing. Doesn't exist in Europe. Fossil evidence shows us that it was there. Pattern 4, let's kind of look at what a pattern 4 is going to be. What's this image of? It's an image of apples. So the fruits changed a little bit. Pattern 4. So what is the pattern of distribution? If you look at that kind of carefully. Pattern 4 shows us, I see a northern distribution, kind of west through Europe to Asia. I see that, okay. What other pattern do I see? I definitely see a southern distribution now. I definitely see something of a pattern this way. I see something of a pattern this way, but now I have to see a pattern this way. I see a pattern between the temperate area of North America and a temperate area, similar in climate, in South America. I see a temperate region. I see a similar climate in Africa. I see Asia, and I see potentially a similar climate in Australia over here. I see that kind of species distribution. I'm now in Malus. I want to say that Malus is a much younger geological plant. Malus, I'm thinking it's about 2 million years. Pear, about 2 million years. Prunus, about the same. These are much younger geological entities on our planet. And we needed to definitely have more diversity of birds and so forth for these plants to be successful. So we can see that we had apple up on the screen, we have Malus, we have Prunus, we have things that have a droop. And so that's being moved by something very, very different. Same pattern, different plant, but look at the fruit type. Think about the fruit type and think about that. So here we go. Sambucus, it has a tasty drupe, and there has to be some birds involved with pattern 4. Has to be. All right. Most of these plants, so what I would do is kind of, I look at the plant. There's some great websites kind of tell you this age of fossil evidence. So they may have been a little bit earlier, but definitely they were around about this time. And so they're much younger from the geological time frame. So we have to have a world that looks like this. 2 million years ago, we weren't too far off of where we are today. But we definitely have a different type of fruit. We definitely have a drupe. And so that's something to think a little bit about. We have something else that's involved. And we definitely have a different courier de bois here. We've got a bird, and we talked a little bit about the mutualism aspect between birds and things with colorful fruits. And we kind of have that, that underlying theme coming back here. And so what we need to do is look at how far birds can move things. They're not moving things from the north hemisphere to the tip of the southern hemisphere in one shot. It's not how it happens. So a bird is going to be eating this colorful drupe, and it's going to pop that seed in. After it's finished eating the drupe, it swallows the seed. Potentially, it doesn't swallow all the seed, but it can swallow seeds. And in that gut of that bird, they can carry that seed for a few days. It's going to go through their digestive tract. It's going to get pooped out, not like in 5 weeks. It's going to get pooped out in a few days. But they've done lots of studies on how far birds, migratory birds, can carry seeds. And in one shot, there's kind of an average of around that 300 kilometers in one shot. So that can move a Sambucus from here to Sarnia. That Sambucus could grow for a few years in Sarnia. It could reach an age where it produces fruit. It's going to pick it up, and it's going to move it 300 kilometers south. It's going to keep moving a plant over a lot of time. South, could be moving it north as well, but right now we're just thinking a little bit about a southern movement of plants. And plants have, inherited seed memory. So a Sambucus that is very good at growing in our climate in Niagara, maybe not so good at growing in Texas. But eventually that Sambucus is going to be migrated through a bird's stomach. It's going to end up in hot Texas. That first initial sprouting of that Sambucus in that hot climate is not going to do very well for that Sambucus. But some Sambucus is going to survive, and it's going to produce fruit. And that fruit is going to have inherited seed memory of a much warmer climate. And it's going to be much more suitable if it was pooped out in Texas to grow. So it can be moved a little bit farther, and maybe another through several decades, it can inherit the seed memory of the next climate that it's being moved to. And so eventually, over time, we can transport seeds a long way through the bird stomach. And we need to acclimate, but eventually, as we distribute seed globally, north and south, in those patterns of migration of birds, we are going to find a climate that we're very comfortable in, and we're going to produce some more species down there over geological time. So if we look at kind of, those major flight migratory pathways, we can definitely see the same distribution that we looked at when we saw seed distribution. So it takes maybe a long time for a plant to be migrated, and eventually the plant does reach a climate zone that it's really comfortable in, and it becomes prolific and diversified. So think a little bit about pattern that we were looking at. I think it was pattern 4, and look at that distribution. And it might have started out as a northern species all the way across our northern hemisphere in North America, Europe, and Asia. But over time, we have another factor that moves that plant around and distributes to where it is today. So there's lots of studies that show that seeds, certain seeds that are tactile, or they have some mechanism of attachment where they can also move much further distances when they get stuck on flight feathers and the birds are migrating over longer distance. So that's kind of interesting. An interesting little sidebar, you'll see the name of the plant in that sidebar. That plant has got a neat adaptation, and it's using those birds to move its seed around. So the bird will come in, it's got a very tasty fruit. Birds come in, they eat that fruit. This annoying seed gets stuck to the birds, but something's gone a little bit haywire. Really, the plant wants that seed to be dispersed over a long period of time. It doesn't happen. In fact, that bird can become so laden with seeds that it can't fly. And eventually it succumbs to that load of seed. So that the plant hasn't got it exactly just right, and it certainly doesn't move it. And this is a bird that's, I think this bird is native to an island chain, and that plant really needs that bird to move it from island to island. But it can't migrate it too much farther away from that location. So it hasn't got it just yet. Let's talk about, we talked about that southern migration idea, but plants also can move northward. Still kind of the idea of migration north or south is that pattern 4. And sassafras is a great example. If we look at sassafras fossils, they never existed in the northern hemisphere. There was a southern hemispherical plant. So remember that Gondwana was migrating south, and sassafras, not super old, not super young, kind of a medium from an evolution or from a geological scale as far as its age. But we did have an attachment back. North America was reattached to South America. And that provides a really nice migration route, whether it's for birds that are doing short hops. There's lots of islands over here where birds maybe do longer hops. And sassafras, which was a southern hemispherical plant, from a fossil evidence point of view, migrated to where we have it today. So that's a pretty big migration. It's thousands of miles of migration. And it also has a droop. And we know that birds and droops kind of have that nice co-partnership. And so just an interest of note, when we had our major asteroid impact 60 million years ago, North America was in rough shape. So if you think about, we still have crocodiles, we still have turtles, we still have a lot of birds, right? We have lizards that have been around for a long time, haven't really changed too much, and they're all egg laying. So egg laying was a good thing. And, you have a lot of things that can really hunker down during bad times. You think about how turtles can hunker down for 6 months at a time. So there was a big migration from the southern hemisphere, a massive migration upwards. And a lot of bird species that we have today originally were southern species of birds, and plants, also definitely they migrated upwardly. And, our friend sassafras is kind of a story. So pattern 5, that's a different type of pattern. I'm just going to look at some oldies. These have been around for a long time. And why do we not have these in the northern hemisphere from a fossil evidence point of view, or even now? So these plants were a southern hemispherical plant, and they've stayed as such. So perhaps during, look at the time that they were here, Pangaea was splitting apart, and they could have been on that southern raft and never been able to get onto that northern raft. Bigger fruit, for whatever reason, just didn't make that migration across, that opening body of water. And then they rafted where they would raft. So they didn't hang out in South America. We could have had some plant movement across that larger land mass. And we definitely see that Wilhelmina pine ended up in this neck of the woods over here. Eucalyptus did the same thing. Norfolk Island pine, same thing, just in an island somewhere over here. So plants in pattern 5 have been drifting maybe on very large land masses for millions of years, and they're ending up somewhere in that southern hemisphere, perhaps in just a pocket, because a lot of that land was breaking up into very specific pockets, like Australia, and it's sitting out there all by itself. Nothophagus, kind of a cousin of oaks in the Fagaceae family. You know, it's the same thing. It's a southern hemispherical plant. And that's the only place that we find Nothophagus from a fossil evidence point of view, as well as from a physical point of view today. So we just see a little bit over here, and we see a little bit over here, and that's it. So a good chance it rafted. And plants, you know, not to say that those plants that rafted down into Australia or in the southern west coast of Chile, you know, they're still kind of moving around a little bit. We still have lots of things that move, like birds. We still have ocean currents. Lots of things are still moving plants around today. But that's just kind of a fifth pattern distribution. Now we're getting to a pattern distribution that's pretty wild, and that's number 6. And it's all about wind. Massive amounts of seed being distributed by wind. So at one time, I remember reading an article about, you know, seeds up in the jet stream. I haven't seen an article since that time, and I've looked pretty carefully because I'm not sure. What I'm reading now is that pollen may be in the jet stream, but not seeds. So we can still move seeds by wind, and they can hop around from one section to the other, give that millions of years, and they get pretty wide distribution. So these little seeds are birch seeds, and they're a wing seed. So let's kind of look at some of those patterns from that Kruseman book. And we'll see that things with wing seed or really light seed have a pretty interesting distribution. That's a pretty wide distribution for poplar. It's pretty dominating. Why is it not in the south? We have different wind patterns in the north that don't mix with the wind patterns in the south. So over time, you know, that has dominated the northern part of our hemisphere. I can't read the name. Is this birch? I'm thinking, is it betula or alder maybe? One or the other. Same thing. It's just that it's hiding underneath something that I'm just not going to touch here. I might stop our webinar, so I'm not going to do that. So pattern 6, wind distribution. And that's a pretty amazing plant. That's our willow. That's a pretty wild distribution. It's globally dominating. It's everywhere. I know it's a pretty small map. It'd be interesting to see if there's any salix down here in Australia. It's hard to say from the size of this map, but that's a pretty wild distribution. To think about it, it's dominating, and it's wind. So plants rely on wind patterns, and they're all modified, you know, their reproductive system to produce that nice wing seed, and off they go. And so if we look at those wind patterns, it's pretty important. From a bigger kind of global perspective, ocean currents. Pattern 7, we need to rely on ocean currents, wave action. And oceans can move seeds. They can also move plants that have broken off and have rafted with seeds on them. They can also move plants that have, you know, animals on them, whether it's a bird, whether it's a lizard. You know, I'm not sure if there's, you know, larger animals that are rafting with plants over time. I'm sure there's going to be some instances of that. The point is that ocean currents have rafted and moved plants all over the place. And so I want you to think a little bit about the Hawaiian chain. So we spent some time with some students in Oahu, and it really kind of was, I remember, you know, flying there. It takes, I don't know how many, maybe 5 hours from San Francisco, I think, something like that. You're out there. And Hawaii has the distinction of being the most isolated landmass on the planet, isolated from any other landmass. I don't know the distance. I thought it was over 2,000 miles is kind of what I remember somebody saying. So I may be off on that a little bit, but I'm not far off. So these just came out of the ocean, you know, through volcanic activity, this island chain, and it's been doing it for a long, long time. And you look at this, the island chain, I mean, it goes right up into the pocket there of Russia. So there's been many, 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 many islands, and they've all kind of, you know, disappeared through erosion over time. But they're heavily populated. So at one time, you know, they were empty. And several eons later, not eons, but several thousands of years later, they were fully populated with plants and animals. So how did they get there? Wind, rafting, pattern 7, waves, plants rafting over, seeds rafting over, birds being carried by hurricanes, that end up on these islands. So it's pretty incredible. So lots and lots of plants rely on water to raft them to new locations and to keep them going. So pattern 7, lots of plant distribution based on ocean currents, and that's pretty incredible. So that is the Hawaiian Islands. It's the most isolated landmass on Earth. And how did a lot of plants get there? How did the birds get there? So, and then the birds can continue to perpetuate them, but the plants had to get there, I think before those birds got there. So they had to get there somehow. So that's important. So that mangrove could break off and off it goes. It could raft and it could end up, hitting the Hawaiian Islands and rooting. So lots of examples of that, definitely. Big events. We took a study tour and we were in Tofino, and we know the fellow at Tofino Botanical. His name is George, and he's a really nice person. If you're ever out that way, introduce yourself, and you and George can talk for a long time. And in the botanical gardens, away from the core, there was a very interesting display, and it was a fish net that was hung up between trees at maybe 50, maybe even longer than that, 60 to 80 feet long, and maybe 35 feet high. And on that fish net were all kinds of interesting objects. Every single thing on that fish net originated in Japan. So when we had that tsunami event in Japan, not that long ago, a very devastating tsunami in Japan, in about 6 weeks and longer, things started to raft onto the shores of Tofino Botanical Garden. So there was hard hats with a person's name, a Japanese name. There was doors. There was a wheelbarrow. There was all kinds of very interesting things, and they were all hung in the net. And that was just to make you think a little bit about that event, or it was kind of an interesting, kind of like a piece of art, and George is kind of interested in that type of stuff. It was kind of heavy. It was good. So if those types of things can be moved across the Pacific Ocean in a matter of a few months, so can plants. So that's important to think a little bit about. So lots of other big events, hurricanes. We know that birds have certainly been pulled, across the equator from Africa into the Caribbean, and they're carried in these, colossal storms. And those birds can be carrying seeds still in their tummies. There could be seeds on their feathers, and definitely they're going to be on a different continent with those items. And away we go. So you need to think a little bit about, that idea of time. And this is the island of Oahu. And there's not very many indigenous plants left on Hawaii. I think it's less than 3. Most of what you see is imported by us. That's kind of sad. So the native habitat of Hawaii that would have been there 1,000 years ago doesn't exist anymore. So we met some people from Foster's Botanical, and they would take expeditions out to the islands that are diminishing, that used to be the volcanic islands in the Hawaiian chain that were above the ocean. And out there, that's where they're finding these indigenous plants that would have been on the island of Oahu. They're way out there, way out in the ocean, and they haven't really been, interfered with by people bringing plants. And so, these large islands that would have been covered by plants from other parts of the globe would have been lush, subtropical type vegetational forests. And this is kind of what they're exploring. And they've gone to some where there's really only about 10 square feet left above the ocean. And there's just a few straggling plants sitting on there, just waiting to be consumed by the ocean. So that's, that was kind of an interesting story that they told us as well. So these would have been mountainous islands in the Hawaiian chain with lots of lush plants that would have rafted in from all kinds of locations. And, plants from a biogeography point of view, they can't migrate anywhere. And if you can't migrate and continue to move, you're going to be in trouble. So the story really is that habitats change, climates change, geographical barriers and impediments change, and plants have to keep moving just to stay ahead of that. And so that cycle kind of never stops. So these are some walking palms to kind of emphasize that idea of kind of walking. So the next time somebody asks you about the 3 W's, we are not talking about the World Wide Web. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the 3 W's. We're talking wind, waves, and wings. And we're talking about plant migration. So that's what the 3 W's are all about. And the next time you kind of visit a plant collection in a botanical gardens or an arboretum, think a little bit about that quiet family reunion. And maybe that's what you are witnessing. So I'd like to leave it at that. So I hope you found it interesting. And I appreciate the opportunity to kind of share that with you.
Oh, thank you, Darrell. That was so fascinating. I know Harriet is going to just unmute herself so she can do the questions.
Okay.
All right. I thought it was Trish, but I can
Go ahead, Harriet. That's okay.
Okay. All right. No problem. So we have a few questions. They're from Rebecca Last. So hopefully there'll be more come in as we speak. Her first question is, does convergent evolution play any role in species distribution?
I think it has to. So convergent evolution or convergent function, whichever wording you want to use, is definitely 2 species coming at it from very different angles, whether it's from different areas or from different perspectives, different biogeographical barriers in front of them, having to change their mechanism of survival. Perhaps that is in the seed, the form of the seed. And by changing the form of the seed, it certainly allows that species to overcome whatever barrier is in front of it for it to be successful. So, a great example definitely is the Sapondaceae family. Sapondaceae, the sortwort family's been around, but we migrated our buddy acers into there, and we migrated our other friends Aesculus into there, those Hippocastanaceae and Aceraceae family. And it bothered me because now I got a different fruit type in the Sapondaceae. Think of Curator, it's got a capsule. Think about an acer, it's got a samara. And then, I definitely found one image. I talked to a friend of mine who was a teacher here for a very short period of time. He was a really smart cookie. He was a student. When he got his master's degree, he came, and the pasture was definitely for him very green where he went, and off he went. But he was a good deep thinker. And we talked a lot about this convergent evolution and the idea of plant movement. And now we have different fruit structures in one family. And then he showed me an image, and it was an image of samaras. The families that have samaras are Fabaceae, which usually has a pod. There's Fabaceae members that have a samara. Meliaceae family, it has samaras, yet it has a different type of fruit. And so I'm much more comfortable with the idea that in one family, I can have different fruit structures because of convergent evolution.
Okay, all right, very good answer. So she also asks, what is meant by coal-based flora?
Coal-based flora are ferns.
Okay,
I'm not just saying are, ferns, but definitely those plants that would have been very prevalent at the time that we now are extracting from the ground that have converted into coal and oil.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And then finally, she
And that was a big era. Those plants were around for a long time.
right.
The world was very warm, super high carbon content, and they were prolific, and they were there for a long time. And so, all those beds of plant material over time, sedimentary, material formed sedimentary rock and encapsulated them, and then pressure and time,
Right.
converted that into our coal-based fossil fuels, or fossil fuels, fern-based fossil fuels.
All right. And then we have, given what we know about species migration from the fossil record and what we know about anthropogenic climate change, should we be concerned about invasive species? Or should we be thinking in terms of maintaining functional ecosystems?
Mm-hmm. Invasive species is an interesting term. We tend to look at flora as a snapshot of right now. And anything that's introduced, that we introduce or somehow is introduced, who knows how it's introduced, and it starts to take off, we look at that as an invasive, and it has lots of implications, definitely. If we kind of just step back a little bit and we look at, a much more perspective over time, there's many things that we see in our snapshot right now as being native that really at one time would have been deemed an invasive.
Right.
So maybe ask the question again, and I'll just think about that a little bit more. Could you just repeat that question?
Sure.
Yeah.
So given what we know about species migration from the fossil record and what we know about anthropogenic climate change, should we be concerned about invasive species? Or should we be thinking in terms of maintaining functional ecosystems?
Okay. So climate change and ecosystems and all the entities in an ecosystem, that's a very challenging thing. Because really, for it to be functional, we need to move the ecosystem. Some entities in there are going to be very good at migrating, and other entities just are not. So that's the challenge. So we talk a lot about, helping the current snapshot and helping our native plants, move due to climate change. But we're not moving an ecosystem. And so that's a really big picture. And if it was me, I prefer to keep the ecosystem as it is at this small snapshot of time that I'm here on this planet. And so I definitely think that invasive species right now are just helping to stick a stick in that spoke and making it more difficult for the ecosystems that we have to handle what's coming at them pretty fast and furious. So that would be my opinion on that.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I don't know what happened. I see on the I see on the QEW, I saw a little bit on the 401. I see that they sprayed all the Phragmites with, I thinking what would have been either Roundup or Garland 4, one or the other. That's a pretty big move. Like, it's not just one patch, and it's been done very, very thoroughly. Whoever was contracted out to. So that's kind of for the Ontario government to make that move for that invasive species. It's telling you something. So anyways, that's not really answering the question. It's just an observation. I just noticed in the last 2 or 3 weeks, it's like, whoa, what's happening to this Phragmite? I thought maybe there's a new bug going after it, but I don't think it's the case.
All right, from Kathy Kavasilis, given current climate change pressures, what are your thoughts on assisted migration? How much and how fast should we be shifting flora? How do we slow the loss of native biodiversity?
Mhm. So that last statement is really important because it is a complex biosystem that we're trying to move. And so I'm okay with assisted migration. I'm just working on a course for Guelph University right now. And so one of the modules I just was finishing was on seed distribution. And you'll see that under the Ontario seed policy, they've really moved away from seed zones. And we're really talking about eco districts right now. And there's a much more fluid opportunity to move seeds over larger distances. And so let's say that you're in eco zone 6, E6, it's like around Midland. What they're really coaching you to do is get seed from the southern part of southwestern Ontario and below our Great Lakes, and bringing that into that eco district. And if you collect zones in the same eco district, they prefer that you move them a little bit north, and that those plants will be better suited for that climate as they get older. So we gotta, if we're gonna do assisted migration, we're behind the 8 ball, definitely. And there are less and less people, I'm going to say of the younger generation, that really are interested in seed collecting. And from a forestry ecological perspective, we barely can keep up with reforestation, let alone moving species because of climate change. We don't have enough seed. We need to collect a lot of seed. So I'd say the more the merrier. I don't think it's, we can do any harm. Plants are going to have to migrate fast. Whole ecosystems are going to have to migrate fast.
Right.
And that's very, very challenging. So if we can help a little bit and educate people a little bit and do our part to reduce our carbon footprint, that would be great. Each of us in our own way. It'd be wonderful.
All right, I think that's all we have.
That's perfect.
So are we turning it over to Claudette now?
Harriet, if it just scroll down, there's 2 more.
Oh, I apologize.
2 new ones.
Okay, didn't see that. Sorry, Darrell, are you up for another couple of questions?
Yeah,
okay.
sure.
So next up is, would a plant that is considered herbicide resistant be classed as a survivor, like fleabane?
That's I don't know the answer to that question. So maybe the person asked the question, just what pesticides would it be resistant to? Because I don't know. I don't know that answer, and that would be something I can learn from.
All right, well, let's move on to the next one. What are your thoughts on developing hybrid cultivars of native species to assist with climate change and preservation of local ecosystems?
Okay. Perhaps instead of hybridization, I would be more of the mindset to do selective breeding so that the offspring have the ability to be more capable of surviving in a hotter climate. So, is that hybridization? Maybe we could use that term for that, but I would definitely do selective breeding. I'm thinking a little bit of a particular seed station in British Columbia, just north of Vernon, British Columbia. So kind of in Kelowna, just north of Kelowna type thing. And one of their specialties is they do exactly that. They do natural open cross, or not, they do cross-pollination. They then harvest that seed. They do trials on that seed. And from those trials, they select very specific plants that are adaptable to warmer climates. And they're using that for their reforestation projects very skillfully. And that's a government agency, and they are focused scientists. And that's, I think, is a very good thing. So I think plant selection, that takes a long time, right?
Right.
It takes a decade or a decade and a half between, you know, your pollination and your selection process before you reach, you know, maturity. So it's very challenging. So I think natural breeding is fine. We've been doing that for thousands of years. Yeah, and genetic modification, not a fan of that.
Yeah, interesting solutions.
Hi, Darrell.
Yes.
A question about flea baying was regarding Roundup from Pat Bowman.
So what was the person's, is it Pat, you said?
Pat.
Yes.
Okay. And so I did not know that flea baying was Roundup resistant. Roundup ready flea baying. I'm gonna do some reading on that. So that's very interesting. That's not good. Oh boy. We met with some folks from Bayer, and Bayer bought Monsanto. So I took a group of students into a boardroom at Bayer, and it was interesting. I thought, oh, this is going to be an interesting, and this group wouldn't hold back. So I didn't really coach them in one way or the other. I said, no, we're going to go on this tour. We're going to keep an open mind, and let's listen. So we had a presentation by Monsanto, or by Bayer, who owns Monsanto, who owns Roundup Ready corn. And the way they launched, it was a very good presentation. And then the question period at the other president, I see all of these hands going up, thinking, oh my God, here we go. But you know, the students asked some very tough questions. And these people are professional, and they fielded those questions perfectly. So, yeah, genetically modified Roundup Ready this and that. I think it's problematic. That's my take on the whole thing. So I think we're going to end up with some species of crops that, you know, we're going to have a hard time getting rid of. And so I think it does help feed the world. There's two sides to that equation, but it, you know, in the future it could get messy. So.
All right. Is that it, folks? I think that's the end.
Yeah, yes, that's it.
Okay.
Over to Claudette. Before I go to Claudette, there's so many comments in here, Darrell, of people enjoying your presentation, finding it fascinating. You can have a look before you go by opening the chat.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, I've already published the poll, I think, as far as I remember, Janet. So I'm going to stop sharing it. But yeah, I just wanted to reiterate that my goodness, people were just blown away, Darrell, by your presentation. Fabulous, thought-provoking, great questions, absolutely fascinating. So, and everyone was so pleased, and we really appreciate you. I think we're ready for Kate at the end, Janet.
That's correct.
Okay. Kate, take it away.
I loved it as well. That was a super, super talk. Do wish we could do this every 2 weeks.
I think it's sleep, you know.
And I love that topic. That's a very interesting topic. Thanks so much to everybody again. And hopefully we can do it next summer. There's a good possibility in person. That would be really, really nice. But, you know, we'll keep in touch and see how it goes, right? Thanks for everybody. Again, also Janet and Claudette for your technical experience, Harriet and Trish, everyone who attended. Next week is our last one of the webinar series. Chris is coming back with part 2 of what to look forward to that's coming in, and also any things that are here already now he's going to be addressing. So I think it's super. I think it was a great, this has been a really good webinar series. Really, really excellent so far.